Deep in the Sudanese desert, there is a field of pyramids. 220 of them, more than Egypt. Narrow, steep, their angles so sharp they look like they are cutting the sky rather than standing under it. A sky that has not changed in 4,000 years. The civilization that built them ruled ancient Egypt for nearly a century. Its kings sat on the throne of Egypt itself. Its iron industry fed trade routes across the known world. Its queens negotiated peace treaties with Rome and won, and almost nobody knows their name. That is not an accident of history. It is the result of one. Egypt tried to erase this civilization, not metaphorically, literally. They chiseled names off stone, they burned records, they rewrote official king lists to pretend an entire century of rulers had never existed. Historians have a Latin term for this, Damnatio Memoriae, the condemnation of memory. It is essentially the ancient world's version of being deleted from the record entirely. Except instead of a moderation team, they used chisels, and the crime was simply having conquered the wrong civilization. The kingdom they tried to erase was called Kush. This is the version that survived. Before there was a Kush that Egypt feared, there was a Kush that Egypt needed. Long before the pyramids of Meroe were built, the region south of Egypt, known to ancient Egyptians as Nubia, was already one of the most strategically important territories in the ancient world. The Nile ran through it. The gold came from it. The trade routes from Central Africa passed through it on their way north to Egypt and the Mediterranean. The Egyptians and the people of Nubia had a relationship that cycled between alliance, rivalry, and outright war across nearly 2,000 years. In the Middle Kingdom period, around 2000 BC, Egypt built a chain of fortresses in Nubia to control the trade routes and the gold. Egyptian administrators, Egyptian officials, Egyptian language and religion spreading south. But cultures that absorb a dominant neighbor's traditions are not always absorbed by them. Sometimes they study those traditions carefully and wait. By the 8th century BC, the wheel had turned. Egypt had fragmented. The unified empire that had once built those Nile fortresses was now a patchwork of competing power centers. Local rulers controlled different regions. The religious authority of the pharaoh, the spiritual foundation of Egyptian political legitimacy, had weakened across generations of internal conflict. To the south, watching from a city called Napata, at the base of a sandstone mountain that looked, from certain angles, exactly like a throne, the Kushites had become something Egypt had not expected, a civilization that considered itself the true keeper of Egyptian tradition.
Jebel Barkal
rises alone from the flat desert of northern Sudan. Not the tallest outcrop in the region, not the most dramatic in isolation, but the land around it is so completely flat that the mountain appears with a sudden authority, a single vertical form against a horizon that offers nothing else for miles in any direction. The Kushites believed the god Amun lived inside it, and when you stand at its base today, looking up at the sheer sandstone face climbing 100 meters above the plain, you understand why. The mountain has a particular shape at its southern end, a tall, narrow pinnacle that breaks away from the main formation, rising alone like a crown or a raised hand. The Kushites saw in it the uraeus, the sacred cobra symbol that appeared on pharaonic crowns. To stand before it was to stand before a sign. What made Jebel Barkal significant was not only its appearance. The Egyptians themselves had long considered it sacred. They called it Jezer Set, the pure mountain, and built their own temple there during the New Kingdom period. When Kush later absorbed Egyptian religious tradition, they inherited a site that both cultures already venerated. At its base, they built Napata, their first great capital, a city of temples, palaces, and administrative buildings that served as the religious heart of the kingdom for centuries. The Temple of Amun at Napata was one of the largest religious complexes in the ancient world. Priests conducted daily rituals there for generations. Its columns carried scenes of Kushite kings making offerings to gods. Its walls recorded a civilization that did not see itself as Egypt's shadow. It says itself as Egypt's rightful heir. The Kushites had absorbed Egyptian religion, Egyptian artistic conventions, Egyptian administrative practices, not as subjects imitating their rulers, but as successors, preparing to take over from rulers who had lost their way. When Egypt's fragmentation reached its lowest point in the mid-8th century BC, with competing dynasties controlling different regions of the country and the religious authority of the pharaoh reduced to competing claims, it was the Kushite king Pi who made a decision that would reshape the ancient world. He looked north at a fractured Egypt and saw not an opportunity for conquest, he saw a spiritual emergency. Pi took the throne at Napata around 744 BC. Within 2 decades, he had seen enough. He marched north into Egypt around 727 BC, and from the start, he framed his campaign in explicitly religious terms. He was not invading, he was restoring. The Egyptians, who had failed to honor Amun properly, had forfeited their legitimacy. Pi was not taking the throne, he was returning it to its proper custodians. Upper Egypt and Thebes, the sacred religious capital, received him largely as he presented himself. The Amun priesthood there had been waiting for someone to restore order. Pi performed the proper rituals, made the proper offerings, and was recognized as the legitimate pharaoh by the priests who still controlled the most important religious sites in the country. But do not mistake that for a bloodless campaign. Further north, at Memphis and Hermopolis, Pi fought fierce, prolonged sieges against Delta coalitions who had no interest in recognizing a Kushite king regardless of his religious credentials. His victory stele records both the mercy shown to cities that surrendered and the swift consequences for those that did not. It was not a gentle campaign, it was a successful one. The stele that documents it, a massive granite slab discovered at Jebel Barkal in 1862, is one of the longest and most detailed Egyptian royal inscriptions ever found. It presents Pi not as a conqueror, but as a purifier, a restorer of divine order. It was written by a Kushite. Egypt had a new pharaoh, and this one came from the south. Pi's successors built on what he had begun. His brother Shabaka consolidated Kushite control across all of Egypt. His nephew Shebitku extended it, and then came Taharqa. Taharqa ruled from approximately 690 to 664 BC. He built monuments across both Egypt and Kush on a scale that matched any pharaoh in Egyptian history. He restored temples that had been neglected. He raised obelisks. He patronized arts and architecture at a level that rivaled the great building programs of earlier centuries. He appears in the Old Testament under the name Tirhaka, mentioned as a ruler powerful enough to concern the Assyrian king Sennacherib. Stop for a moment and consider what had actually happened here. A civilization from the south, one that Egypt had spent centuries treating as a source of gold, tribute, and enslaved labor, now sat on the oldest and most famous throne in the ancient world. Kushite pharaohs were not tolerated rulers. They were recognized by Egypt's priests, crowned in Egypt's temples, and worshipped under Egypt's gods. They restored what Egypt's own rulers had let fall into neglect. They ruled one of history's great civilizations, and they ruled it well. For nearly a century, the most powerful seat in the ancient world belonged to Kush. And then the Assyrians arrived. The Assyrian Empire was the superpower of the ancient Near East. Professional soldiers, iron weapons, a military system that had processed kingdoms across Mesopotamia and the Levant into provinces. In the 600s and 70s BC, they turned their attention to Egypt. Taharqa fought. He reclaimed territory. He lost it again. His successor, Tutankhamun, launched one final campaign to retake what had been lost. It failed. By the time it was over, Assyrian-backed Egyptian rulers were installed across the country, loyal to Nineveh, not Napata. Kush retreated south, and Egypt began to settle a score. But the rulers who followed had a problem. The 25th dynasty had been legitimate, recognized by priests, accepted by populations, documented in temple records and official correspondence across the country. You could not simply pretend a century of rule had not happened, so they did something more deliberate than ignoring it. They erased it. Kushite names were chiseled off temple walls. Statues were destroyed or altered. The official king lists compiled under the new dynasty simply omitted the 25th dynasty entirely, moving from the 24th straight to the 26th, as if the Kushite rulers had been a clerical error rather than a century of governance. Historians call this Damnatio Memoriae, the condemnation of memory. In the ancient world, it was the most complete punishment available. You could not kill someone twice, but you could ensure that nothing with their name on it survived, that no record acknowledged their existence, that future generations would open the official history and find only a blank where they had stood. Then, in the early 6th century BC, the Egyptian pharaoh Psamtik II went further. He launched a military expedition deep into Kushite territory. His army reached Napata. They burned the palace, they damaged the temples, and they made sure to carve Psamtik's name into the ruins, the ancient equivalent of tagging your name on a building you just burned down, to make sure history knew who had done it. Kush survived the attack, but the capital moved permanently south to Meroe, and the connection to Egypt, the religious and cultural bridge the 25th dynasty had reinforced, began to break. Meroe. If Napata was Kush's spiritual heart, Meroe was its engine. Located between the 5th and 6th cataracts of the Nile, the rocky rapids that made river travel difficult for invading forces, Meroe sat in a natural fortress. The city itself was substantial. Royal palaces, elaborate bath complexes, water gardens that had no equivalent in the surrounding region, lions carved in sandstone guarding temple entrances, a layout that spoke of permanence rather than impermanence, of a civilization that intended to stay. But what made Meroe genuinely powerful was what surrounded it: iron. The landscape around Meroe is still marked by slag heaps so large they are visible in modern satellite imagery, the waste product of iron smelting on an industrial scale. Archaeologists have found furnaces that operated continuously for generations. The volume of iron produced here was not artisanal, it was not ceremonial, it was a supply chain. Historians have given Meroe a nickname, the Birmingham of ancient Africa, which tells you two things. First, the scale genuinely rivaled a 19th century manufacturing hub. Second, historians have a somewhat limited range of industrial comparisons, but the nickname fits. If Meroe had existed today, it would not be a boutique workshop, it would be a logistics operation. Iron weapons moving north, iron tools trading across sub-Saharan Africa, ironwork reaching the Red Sea routes and disappearing into markets stretching from Arabia to India. In the ancient world, iron was what silicon is today. Whoever controlled its production controlled the pace of everyone else's development. Meroe controlled it for centuries, and Meroe developed its own writing system, Meroitic script. We can read it phonetically. We still do not fully understand what it says. Researchers have been working on it for over a century. One more layer of the silence Egypt helped create. But the most striking thing about Meroe is not its iron industry or its undeciphered script. It is its queens. Kush had reigning queens called Kandakes, not consorts, not regents ruling on behalf of young sons, military commanders who led armies, negotiated treaties, and governed as full sovereigns in their own right. This was not a ceremonial title, it was a job description. Rome discovered what this meant in the 1st century BC, after Octavian, soon to be Augustus, defeated Cleopatra and absorbed Egypt into the Roman Empire in 30 BC. Roman forces began pushing south toward Kushite territory. Rome had a standard procedure for new neighbors: establish Roman authority, collect tribute, formalize the relationship on Roman terms. It had worked across most of the known world. The territories Rome reached generally understood their position quickly. Roman officials looked at Kush, calculated the distance from Rome, noted the relative size of the Kushite military compared to the Roman legions available in Egypt, and arrived at what seemed like a reasonable conclusion. This should not take long. Then they met a Kandake named Amanirenas. She had already lost an eye in earlier fighting. She kept going. Over several years, Kushite forces raided Roman-controlled Egypt, pushed back against Roman military advances, and captured a bronze head of Augustus, the face of the most powerful man in the world, detached from its statue, and buried it under the steps of a temple in Meroe, deliberately. Anyone entering that temple would walk over Rome's emperor. When Roman forces retaliated and drove south, Amanirenas met them and held. The peace negotiations took place at the island of Samos around 21 BC. Rome, which demanded tribute from virtually every territory it encountered, which treated anything less than full submission as an insult to Roman dignity, signed a treaty that gave Kush favorable trade terms and explicitly exempted the kingdom from paying tribute. A kingdom in the Sudanese desert had negotiated a trade deal with the most powerful military empire on earth, won, and got the Romans to put it in writing. Strabo, the Roman geographer who documented the negotiations, seemed genuinely puzzled about how this had happened. So were the Romans. Her name was Amanirenas. She appears in almost no popular history. The pyramids at Meroe are still there. I stood at those pyramids once, nobody else around. The desert goes very quiet in the afternoon. Standing there, you understand something the official records never wanted to acknowledge. The Kushites were not afraid of being forgotten. They built 220 monuments to the dead in the middle of the desert. They were not building for the present, they were building for anyone who would come later and bother to look. Kush did not fall in a single dramatic moment. It contracted over centuries. Trade routes shifted as the Red Sea economy reorganized. The kingdom of Aksum, rising in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, challenged Kushite dominance of East African commerce. By the 4th century AD, the kingdom that had once ruled Egypt had become a regional power described by outside observers with increasing condescension. The last known Kushite inscription dates to around AD 350. After that, silence. But silence is not the same as disappearance. The pyramids of Meroe are still standing. You can visit them. You can press your hand against stone cut and placed by people who believed their civilization was eternal. The iron slag heaps are still visible from space. The bronze head of Augustus that Amanirenas buried under her temple steps was excavated in 1910 and now sits in the British Museum, a Roman emperor's face preserved for 2,000 years beneath a Kushite floor. And the story of the erasure itself has become evidence. Because if Kush was a footnote, why did Egypt try so hard to erase it? You do not spend centuries chiseling names off walls for rivals you consider insignificant. You do not travel deep into foreign territory to burn a city's palace and temples, and then carve your own name into the ruins for a civilization you have already dismissed. The scale of the effort tells you exactly how much Kush mattered. Psamtik II did not march into Sudan to erase something irrelevant. He marched to erase something that everyone still remembered, which means the erasure was never really about making people forget. It was about making it too difficult to remember. 220 pyramids still stand in the Sudanese desert. A treaty Amanirenas won is still in the historical record. The slag heaps at Meroe are still visible from space. The bronze head of Rome's first emperor, buried under a Kushite temple floor for 2,000 years, sits in a museum in London. The erasure failed. What did not fail, until now, was our willingness to repeat it by simply not asking. Kush was not forgotten the way things are forgotten. It was buried the way things are buried when someone needs them to stay down. And the difference between those two things matters more than it might seem. Because forgetting is passive. Burial requires effort, and effort, in history as in everything else, leaves traces. The pyramids are still there. That was always going to be the problem with chisels. Stone remembers.